The Black Cat. For the most wild, yet most homely narrative which I'm about to pen, I neither expect nor select belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect it, in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet mad I'm not, and very surely do I not dream. But tomorrow I die, and today I would unburrow my soul. My immediate purpose is to place before the world, plainly, succinctly, and without comment, a series of mere household events and their consequences. These events have terrified, have tortured, have destroyed me, yet I will not attempt to expound them. To me, they have persisted little but horror. To many they will seem less terrible than barroques. Hereafter, perhaps, some intellect may be found which will reduce my phantasm to the commonplace. Some intellect more calm, more logical, and far less excitable than my own, which will perceive, in the circumstances I detail and are, nothing more than an ordinary succession in very neutral causes and effects. From the infancy I was noted from the docility and humanity of my disposition. My tenderness of heart was even so conspicuous as to make me the jest of compassions. I was especially fond of animals, and was indulged by my parents with a great variety of pets. With these I spent the most of my time, and never was so happy as when feeding and caressing them. This peculiarity of character grew with my growth, and in my manhood I derived from it one of my principal sources of pleasure. To those who have cherished an affection for the faithful and sedulous dog, I need hardly to be at the trouble of expanding the nature of intensity of the gratification thus deservable. There is something in the selfish and self-sacrificing love of a brute which goes directly to the heart of him who has frequent occasion to test the paltry friendship of gossamer fidelity of a mere man. I married early, and was happy to find in my wife a disposition of uncognizable of my own. Observing my patronly for domestic pets, she lost no opportunity of procuring those of the most agreeable kind. We had birds, goldfish, a fine dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. This latter was remarkably large and a beautiful animal, entirely black, and sensuous to an astonishing degree. In speaking of his intelligence, my wife, who at heart was not a little tinctured with its superstition, made frequent allusion to an ancient popular notion which regarded all black cats as witches in disguise. Not that she was ever suspicious upon this point, and I mentioned the matter at all for no better reason than that it happens just now to be remembered. Pluto was the cat's name, was my favorite pet and playmate. I alone fed him, and he attended me whenever I went about the house. I was even with difficulty that I could prevent him from following me through the streets. Our friendship lasted in this manner for several years, during which my general temperament and character, through the instrumentality of field intemperance, had, I blush to confess it, experienced a radical alteration for the worse. I grew, day by day, more moody, more irritable, more regardless of feelings of others. I suffered myself to use interpretate language to my wife. At length, I even offered her personal violence. My pets, of course, were made to feel the change in my disposition. I not only neglected, but ill-used them. For Pluto, however, I still retained sufficient regard to restrain me from maltreating him, as I made no sculpture for maltreating the rabbits, the monkey, or even the dog. When by accident, or through affection, they came in my way. But my disease grew upon me, for what disease is like alcohol? And at length, even Pluto, who was now becoming old, and, consequently, somewhat peevish, even Pluto began to experience the effects of my ill temper. One night, returning home, much intoxicated from one of my haunts upon town, I fancied that the cat avoided my presence. I seized him, when in his fright at my violence, I inflicted a slight wound upon my hand with its teeth. The fury of a demon instantly possessed me. I knew myself no longer. My original soul seemed, at once, to take its flight from my body, and a more than fiendishly malevolence. Gin nurtured, thrilled every fibre of my frame. I took from a waistcoat pocket a penknife, opened it, grasped the poor beast by the throat, and deliberately cut one of its eyes from its socket. I blush, I burn, I shudder, while I pen the damnable atrocity, when the reason returning with the morning, when I slept off the fumes of the night's debauch, I expected a sensible half of horror, half of remorse, for the crime of which I had been guilty, but it was, at best, a feeble and equivocal feeling, and the soul remained untouched. I again plunged into excess, and drowned in wine all memory of the deed. In the meantime, the cat slowly recovered. The socket of the lost eye presented, it is true, a frightful appearance, but he no longer appeared to suffer any pain. He went about the house as usual, but, as might be expected, fled in extreme terror at my approach. I had no much of my old heart left, as to be, at first, grieved by the evident dislike on the part of the creature which had once so loved me. But this feeling soon gave place to irritation, and then came, as if to my final and irreversible overthrow, the spirit of perverseness. Of the spirit philosophy takes no account, yet I am not more sure that my soul lives. That I am perverseness is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart, one of the indivisible primary facilities, or sentiments which gave direction to the character of man. Who was not, 100 times, found myself committing a vile or silly action, for no other reason than because he knows he should not, Have we not a prepersonal inclination, and a thief of best judgment, to violate that which is law merely because we understand it to be such? The spirit of perverseness, I say, came to my final overthrow. It was such an unfathomable longing of the soul to vex itself, to offer violence to its own nature, to do wrong for the wrong's sake only, that urged me to continue and finally to consummate the injury I had inflicted upon my unoffendable brute. One morning, in cold blood, I slipped a noose about its neck and hung it to the limb of a tree, hung it with the tears streaming from my eyes, and with the bitterness remorse at my heart, hung it because I knew that it loved me, because I felt it had given me no reason of offense. Hung it because I knew that it was doing. I was committing a sin, a deadly sin, that would so jeopardize my immortal soul as to place it, if such a thing were possible, even beyond my reach of infinite mercy, with the most merciful and most terrible God. One night, of the day on which the cruel deed was done, I was aroused from sleep by the cry of fire. The curtains of my bed were in flames. The whole house was ablaze. It was with great difficulty that my wife, a servant, and myself made our escape from the conflagration. The destruction was complete. My entire worldly wealth was swallowed up, and I resigned myself, dancing forward to despair. I'm above the weakness of seeking to establish a sequence of cause and effect between the disaster and atrocity, but I'm detailing a chain of facts and wish not to leave even a possible link imperfect. On the day succeeding the fire, I visited the rooms. The walls, with no exception, had fallen in. This exception was found in compartment wall, not very thick, which stood about the middle of the house, and against which had rested the head of my bed. The plastering had here, in great measure, resisted the action of fire, a fact which I attributed to its having been recently spread. About this wall a dense crowd were collected. Many persons seemed to be exclaiming, a particular portion of it, a very minute of eager attention. The words strange, singular, and other similar expressions excited my curiosity. I approached and saw, as if graven in bas relief upon the white surface, a figure of a gigantic cat. The impression was given with an accuracy truly marvelous. There was a rope about the animal's neck. When I first beheld the apparition, for I could scarcely regard it as less, my wonder and my terror were extreme, and at length reflection came to my aid. The cat, I remembered, had been hung in my garden, adjacent to my house. Upon the alarm of fire, this garden had been immediately filled by the crowd, by some one of whom the animal must have cut from the tree and thrown, through an open window, into my chamber. This had probably been done with a view of arousing me from sleep. The falling of other walls had compressed the victim of my cruelty into the substance of freshly spread plaster, the lime of which, with the flames and the ammonia of the carcass, had then accomplished the portraiture as I saw it. Although I thus radiantly accounted to my reason, if not altogether to my consequence, for the startling fact just detailed, I did not the less fail to make a deep impression upon my fancy. For months, I could not rid myself of the phantasm of the cat, and during this period, there came back into my spirit a half-sentiment that seemed, but was not, remorse. I went so far as to regret the loss of the animal, and to look about me among the vile hounds, which I now haphazardly frequented, for another pet of the same species, and of somewhat similar appearance, with which to supply its place. One night, as I sat, half stupefied, in a den of more than infamy, my attention was drawn to some black object reposing upon the head of one of the immense hogsheads of gin, or the rum, which constituted the chief furniture of the apartment. I had been looking steadily at the top of the hogshead for some minutes, and what now caused me to surprise was the fact that I had not sooner perceived the object thereupon. I approached it and touched it with my hand. It was a black cat, a very large one, fully as large as Pluto, and closely resembling him in every respect but one. Pluto had not a white hair upon any portion of his body, but this cat had a large, although indifferent splotch of white, covering nearly the whole region of its breast. Upon my touching him, he immediately arose, purred loudly, rubbed against my hand, and appeared delighted with my notice. This, then, was the very creature of which I was in search. I at once offered to purchase it from the landlord, but this person made no claim to it, knew nothing of it, had never seen it before. I continued my caresses, and, when I prepared to go home, the animal evinced a disposition to accompany me. I permitted to do so, occasionally stooping and patting it as I proceeded. When it reached the house, it domesticated itself at once and became immediately a great friend with my wife. For my own part, I soon found a dislike to it arising within me. This was just the reverse of what I had anticipated, but I know not how or why it was. Its evident fondness for myself rather than disgusted and annoyed. By slow degrees, these feelings of disgust and annoyance rose into the bitterness and hatred. I avoided the creature, a certain sense of shame and the remembrance of my former deed and cruelty, preventing me from physically abusing it. I did not, for some weeks, strike or otherwise violently ill-use it, but gradually, very gradually, I came to look upon it with uneditable loathing, and to flee silently from its odious presence, as from the breath of pestilence. What added, no doubt, to my hatred for the beast was the discovery, on the morning after I brought it home, that, like Pluto, it had been deprived of one of its eyes. This circumstance, however, only endeared it to my wife, who, as I have already said, possessed in a high degree that humanity of feeling which had once been distinguishable trait, and the source of many of my simplest and purest pleasures. With the aversion to the scat, however, its particularly for myself seemed to increase. I followed my footsteps with a pertinacity which it would be difficult to make the reader comprehend. Whenever I sat, it would crouch beneath my chair, or spring upon my knees, covering me with its loathsome careness. If I arose to walk, it would get between my feet and thus nearly throw me down, or, fastening its long and sharp claws in my dresser, clamber, and its manner to my breast. At such times, although I longed to destroy it with a blow, I was yet withheld from doing so, partly by the memory of my former crime, but chiefly, let me confess it at once, by absolute dread for the beast. This dread was not exactly a dread of physical evil, and yet I should be at a loss how otherwise to define it. I am almost ashamed to own, yes, even in its felon's cell, I am almost ashamed to own that the terror and horror with which the animal inspired me had been heightened by one of the merest cherishes it would be possible to conceive. My wife had called my attention, more than once, to the character of the mark of white hair, of which I have spoken, and which constituted the sole visible difference between the strange beast and the one I had destroyed. The reader will remember that this mark, although large, had been originally very indefinite, but by slow degrees nearly imprecisable, and which for a long time my reason struggled to reject as fanciful, it had, at length, assumed to rigorous distinctness of outline. It was now the representation of an object that I shuddered to name, and for this, above all, I loathed and dreaded, and would have rid myself of the monster I dared. It was now, I say, the image of a hideous and ghastly thing, of the gallows. O mournful, a terrible engine of horror and crime, of agony and of death. And now was I indeed wretched beyond the wretchedness of mere humanity, and the brute beast, whose fellow I had contemptuously destroyed, a brute beast to work out for me, for a mere man fashioned in the image of high God, so much too insufferable who, alas, neither by day nor by night knew I blessing of rest any more. During the former, the creature left me no moment alone, and in the latter, I started hourly from dreams of utter fear, to find the hot breath of the thing upon my face, and at vast weight, the incarnate nightmare that I had no power to shake off, incumbent eternally upon my heart. Breath the precious of torments such as these, the feeble remnants of the good within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates. The darkest and most evil thoughts, the moodiest and usual temper, increased to hatred of all things, and of all mankind, while most is sudden, frequent, and ungovernable outbursts of fury, to which I now blindly abandoned myself. My uncomplaining wife, alas, was the most usual and most patient of sufferers. One day, she accompanied me, upon some household errand, into the cellar of the old building which our poverty compelled us to inhabit. The cat followed me down the steep stairs, and nearly throwing me headlong, exasperated me to madness, uplifting an axe, and forgetting in my wrath the childish dread which had hitherto stayed my hand. I aimed a blow at the animal which, of course, would have proven instantly fatal had it descended as I wished. But this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife, goaded by the interference into rage more than demoniacal. I withdrew my arm from my grasp and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead upon the spot, without a groan. This hideous murder accomplished, I set myself forthwith, and with entire deliberation, to the task of concealing the body. I knew that I could not remove it from the house, either by day or by night, without the risk of being observed by neighbors. Many projects entered my mind. At one period I thought of cutting the corpse into minute fragments and destroying them by fire. At another, I resolved to dig a grave for it in the floor of the cellar. Again, I deliberated about casting it in the well in the yard, about packing it in a box, as if merchandise, with the usual arrangements, and so getting a porter to take care of the house. Finally, I hit upon what considered a far better expedient than either of these. I determined to wall it up in the cellar, as the monks of the Middle Ages are recorded to have walled up the victims. For the purpose as such as this, the cellar was well adapted. Its walls were loosely constructed, and had lately been plastered throughout with rough plaster, which the dampness of the atmosphere had prevented from hardening. Moreover, in one of the walls was a projection, cast a vast chimney, or fireplace, that had been filled up, and made the resemblance the rest of the cellar. I made no doubt that I could readily displace the bricks at this point, insert the corpse, and wall the whole up as before, so that no eye could detect anything suspicious. And in this calculation I was not deceived. By means of crowbar I easily dislodged the bricks, and, having carefully disposed the body against the inner wall, propped it in a position, while with little trouble I relaid the whole construction as it originally stood, having procured mortar, sand and hair. With every possible precaution, I plastered a plaster which could not be distinguished from the old, and with this I carefully went over the new brickwork. When I had finished, I felt satisfied that I was right. The wall did not present the slightest appearance of having been disturbed. The rubbish on the floor was picked up with minus care. I looked around triumphantly and said to myself, "Here at last, then, my labor has not been in vain." My next step was to look for the breast which had been in the cause of which wretchedness, for I had, at length, firmly resolved to put it to death. Had I able to meet with it at the moment, there could have been no doubts of its fate, but it appeared that the crafty animal had been alarmed at the violence of my previous anger, and forebore the presence itself and my present mood. It is impossible to describe or imagine the deep, the blissful sense of relief which the absence of the detested creature occasioned in my bosom. It did not make its appearance during the night, and thus for one night at last, since my introduction into the house, I soundly, tranquility slept. I slept even with the burden of murder upon my soul. The second and third day passed, and still my tormentor came not. Once again, I breathed as a free man. The monster, in terror, had fled the premises forever. I should behold it no more. My happiness was supreme. The guilt of my dark deed disturbed me a little. But few inquiries had been made, and these had been readily answered. Even a search had been instituted. But, of course, nothing was to be discovered. I looked upon my future facility as secured. Upon the 4th day of the assassination, a party of police came, very unexpectedly, into the house, and proceeded again to make righteous investigation of the premises. Secure, however, in the insecurability of my place of concealment, I felt no embarrassment whatsoever. The officers bade me accompany them in the search. They left no nook or corner unexplored. At night, for the 3rd and 4th time, they descended into the cellar. I quivered not a muscle. My heart beat calmly, as that of one who slumbered in innocence. I walked the cellar from end to end, folded my arms upon bosom, and roamed easily to and fro. The police were thoroughly satisfied and prepared to depart. The glee at my heart was too strong to be retained. I burned to say, if but one word, by the way of triumph, and render doubly sure the assurance of my guiltness. Gentlemen, I said at last, as the party ascended the steps, I delighted to have you allay your suspicion. I wish you all health, and a little more courtesy. By the by, gentlemen, this is a very well-constructed house. In a rabid desire to say something easily, I sacredly knew what I uttered at all. I may say excellently well-constructed house. These walls... Are you going, gentlemen? These walls are soundly put together. And here, through the mere frenzy of bravado, I ripped heavenly, with a cane which I held in my hand, upon that very portion of the brickwork behind, which stood the corpse of my wife in bosom. But may God shield and deliver me from the fangs of the arch-fiend. No sooner had the reverberation of my blows sunk into silence, than I had answered by a voice from within the tomb, by a cry, at first muffled and broken, like a sobbing of a child, and then quickly swelling into a loud, long, continuous scream, uttering anomalously and inhuman, a howl, a wailing shriek, half of horror and half of triumph, such as might have arisen only out of hell, conjointly from the throats of the damned, in their agony at the demons that exult of damnation. Of my own thought is it thrally to speak. Swooning, I staggered to the opposite wall. For one instant the body upon the stairs remained motionless. Through extremity of terror and of awe, in the next a dozen straight arms were toiling at the wall. It felt bodily. The corpse, already greyly decayed and clotted with gore, stood erect before the eyes of the spectators. Upon its head, a red extended, a mouth, and solitary eye of fire, sat the hideous beast, whose craft and secured me into murder, and whose affirming voice had consigned me to the hangman. I had walled the monster up within the tomb,